since Donald Trump's inauguration, which is about 3 weeks ago now, obviously little bits and bobs have happened here and there, and things have been disclosed. Some of it is pretty spectacular, and the things that he promised he was going to do, which he's done, and there's the reaction from that, the fallout to some of that. But generally speaking, it seems to have brought the country together, Gary, which is a lovely thing to say.
Yes.
It's a lovely thing to see, and I think it's having an effect. It is having an effect over the rest of the world. But the thing I think nobody expected was this USAID stuff to surface, to be made public, and for when it started to be disclosed. But some of the things to appear on this list of things that have been supported by the previous administration, by Joe Biden's government, some of the things that were being supported on that, just are so wild things going on in other countries. And it's one thing for them to be supporting sort of fringe diversity stage plays in some backwater country somewhere, you know, as ridiculous as that sounds. You know, you think, oh, is it that unusual?
Or half a million condoms for Palestine, as an example.
But that's the kind of thing you would expect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to be part of. But the one thing I didn't expect to see on there was a British establishment such as the BBC involved in it in any way at all. So I get back to the internet the way you do and get onto social media, and I just see a barrage of things, and even I can start getting DMs from American friends saying, you know, we're paying for your BBC here.
That's
you know,
right.
we've been bankrolling the BBC. I think, whoa, what's going on? I mean,
2.1 million to help the BBC value the diversity of Libyan society. I guess you needed our help to show that Libyan society was valuable or something.
I mean, in a sense, it has. You know, obviously, because Britain and America, we are cousins. It's nice to know that, you know, we're all collectively being ripped off by the BBC now, not just us. Something else that's bonded us all together. But it is so ridiculous. And you think to yourself, well, when it comes to the difference between the British Broadcasting Corporation and BBC Studios, there's a massive grey area there, which the BBC exploits to the domestic population every chance they get. So they keep us, the people, their customers, the people who still have a license fee, and the customers they're trying to sort of to bring back by any means they can. They are literally knocking your door and sort of trying to scare you into having a TV license again. So there's all that going on. But at the same time, they're also pleading poverty constantly. They've got so much money, and yet they are constantly saying how hard up they are. I think the upshot of it is, you think, how have they got the gall to go to anybody for funding, and under what circumstances? And how would the American people feel about that, in all sincerity? I mean, when you saw this break, Gary, what were your thoughts?
Well, the depth of corruption that this highlights is not surprising that it exists, but I'm basically more shocked that this has gone kind of undetected, you know, and unreported for so long, intentionally on their part. I don't think I've heard anything which is said. I've been looking for a report which says, when did this start? Now, the USAID as a concept started back, you know, with JFK, and it was more about humanitarian, legitimate humanitarian means. But over the decades, it has been, corrupted into this kind of, unaccountable, bottomless slush fund that they can use to promote this ideology in our country and internationally. And the breadth of it, from, not even all the LGBT stuff, but, like a new Sesame Street show in Iraq, this, that, and the other thing.
unsurprisingly, if you do a search for any information on this, you don't get many results. I have found out, you're quite right, it has been going on for years and years and years in one form or another, but it seems to have been drastically exploited by the previous administration. And the amount specifically concerning what was going to the BBC, that funding doubled during that election year, so last year, which should be suspicious in itself at a time where it's austerity all over the world, isn't there? The cost of living crisis, and yet they doubled the amount from the USAID, as some call it. That was doubled in that election year. That's conspicuous in itself.
And you're not talking. I'm sorry, John, but just to clarify, you're talking about the BBC directly. You're not talking about the BBC. What's the charity media action, which is separate.
The American people haven't been bankrolling the BBC. The BBC has been bankrolled by the British public, the same as ever, funded by the license fee, which is meant to be voluntary, and you can give up your license at any time, but they just make it as difficult for the British public as they possibly can to do that. So it was a massive exaggeration to say that the American people were bankrolling the BBC, but American tax dollars have been going to the BBC directly to something that they've got. It's officially down as a charity. It's a BBC charity called Impact Media, which acts mostly in underdeveloped countries, India and Africa, according to the information that I've got. And it interferes with media in those territories. And that does seem to line up with the kind of thing that you were describing a moment ago, Gary, the reason why that fund exists in the first place on the other side of the Atlantic.
I think, for me, this is classic BBC of, they always come to you and say, hang on, we're skint, we haven't got any money. Yet they run all these little side deals, and it's an easy way for them to launder money or hide money, and money that's being used for certain operations. And I think, Dan, we've been suspicious for so many years now about how biased the BBC has become. Now, the next few years is really going to put a lid on it. Not put a lid on it, is going to drill deep into it. And they're going to find out, especially from the US, and what they're doing with Elon Musk and, Golden Balls, I think he's called, and the others.
Golden Balls. Is that David Beckham?
Yeah. So he's little IT guru, isn't he? He's called Golden Balls, apparently.
Okay.
Fair dues. But they're literally going to be drilling into everything, and I would say that this isn't going to be the last you're going to come across the BBC's name in connection with things. I think it's very, very telling, and I think where I've talked to you guys before about the fact that with all this ideology stuff, it's 2 to 3 years behind the curve. The reason it's still going on is because they are still getting some funding, some slush funds from different places, not just the license fee. I think they're getting it from other avenues as well. Similar, I would say, to Disney have got BlackRock involved. They finance them.
Oh, see what you mean.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of side funding going to the BBC to basically make them push a particular narrative.
We should probably say to everybody watching that everything we've already said and everything we're about to say is allegedly.
Also, in all sincerity, I'm not sure how much of this is public. It is safe to discuss because it does seem that Donald Trump is being quite targeted, isn't he, towards places such as the CIA?
They're panicked. They're trying to shut everything he's doing down, especially all the Doge stuff, the Department of Government Efficiency, all the stuff about USAID. This has been their lifeblood, undetected, undiscovered, for years and years and years, which is why everybody's in a panic mode that it's all getting shut down. The USAID Inspector General just yesterday was fired by Trump. So he's not wasting any time.
And this is the same USAID Inspector General, if I'm right, Gary, that had a standard salary over her career, and is now worth something like $40 billion.
Yeah, probably.
And it's the same when you look at senators and House members. They have a standard salary of, say, like $200,000 to serve as a congressman or woman or a senator, but yet suddenly they're worth something like $60 million. So that money's got to come from somewhere, and that's
Musk is auditing all of that.
Yeah, and
it says something, doesn't it? That it says something that our prime minister, the current prime minister, charisma vacuum that is Keir Starmer, wasn't invited, deliberately left out of the invitations for the inauguration, whereby other British politicians were present. It's noticeable because of the absence, isn't it? So it's very clear that Trump knows that the Labour Party back then acted against Trump. Starmer had said publicly how he was anti-Trump, and they sent, didn't they, some of their own, however many party members? It wasn't the hundreds, wasn't it, to the state?
Yeah, it was. And
influenced the election. That was the plan, wasn't it?
And what is it they said at the time, Dan? A Labour spokesman came out and says what they do on their own time is entirely up to them. And it's like, yeah, of course it is. Sending Labour members to the United States to campaign on behalf of Kamala Harris and the Democrats. Yeah, that's what you do on your own time. But I bet you what's going to come out in the next few months, they're going to actually start finding trails where Labour have actually funded this excursion themselves. And I love it that Trump's, this is the classic example, isn't it, of F around and find out, Because it's all coming back to bite them in the bum, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's not, although we don't know this, I mean, the implication, it's alleged, you could draw the conclusion that because of this money that's gone from USAID in the BBC's direction, albeit to their charity, you do wonder, was this funding of the BBC's conditional to encourage them, allegedly, to report consistently negatively on Donald Trump throughout the election campaign, particularly in that final election year itself, the crucial election year, where they pulled out every stop, didn't they, to make sure that he couldn't get elected?
I mean, it's definitely had conditions on it that this money is subject to you're doing a job for us. But I would say it's slightly different. But I will give you an example of Larry Fink of BlackRock last year, where he basically was on a stage and he said, with the whole DEI and woke stuff, he said, sometimes it's not enough to ask people to do it. Sometimes you've got to force them to do it.
Oh, right.
And that's what they're doing with the money over the last few years. They've been investing in lots of corporate firms and basically saying, you apply this DEI nonsense or you're not getting any more funds. We'll cut you off at the source. And it's not just about corporate companies not being able to get that money from BlackRock. They would also cut them off from getting finance. So as an example, if you're a Disney and you want to finance a movie, you don't pay for it out of your own funds. You get a finance loan from like these large companies that BlackRock control. They just say, no, we're not giving you any. We're cutting you off. Therefore, you're stuffed. And it's the same with other corporate companies. If they want to expand as well, or they want to purchase another company, it's all connected with the same financial restrictions and pressures. Do this for us, otherwise we cut you off. And there's no doubt, especially with the BBC, that would have been part of the agreement. I don't know if you saw, Dan, as well, speaking from strictly from a UK point of view, but I think it was last week there was something came out, and I need to double check my data on it, but it was the EU have been doing similar things. They were funding the Labour Party. They've been financially funding the Labour Party, and pushing a certain narrative. So it's everywhere. And I think, these next 4 years are going to be very, very telling, because I've always said about the UK, we're always downstream with the US. So, you know, I think politicians always used to say, you know, if the US sneezes, we catch a cold. So we will have it come down the river eventually to us, and it will get very interesting. And I think it's going to go deep. I think it will go not just the BBC, but I think we'll find there's a lot of politicians on certain payrolls as well. And I think that will come
not
out.
just politicians either. We all know, I think it's fairly public, of the link between the BBC and the Guardian newspaper. As I understand it, the Guardian wouldn't really be publishing anymore if not for the support of the BBC. But Bill Gates is connected to the Guardian as well, allegedly.
There you go. And you know,
funds it to some extent. How involved is he with the BBC? I think he gives money to the BBC as well.
Yeah, and again, this is another example where, you know, when our Lord and Master became Prime Minister, and he said he didn't want, he had a pop at Elon Musk, and he said we shouldn't have billionaires getting involved in British politics. The same week that he had Larry Fink from BlackRock, and he had Bill Gates at number 10 to have a conversation with him about investment into the UK. So it's all right when one side does it, but it's not all right when another side does it, you know.
Well, and it's kind of similar to, you know, the Politico scandal over here. You know, Politico is a U.S. government or a U.S. kind of quote unquote news site. But basically, it turns out now that the U.S. government has given them north of $34 million. And of course, basically that just turns them into, you know, the puppet media for the Democrats, and, you know, to push whatever ideology. I mean, it's already come out that, you know, they were told, like with all the Hunter Biden scandal, don't report on that, or don't report on the laptop, because they were taking their marching orders from the Democratic Party with all the checks they were getting.
It becomes an organ of that state, doesn't it? How can it not? That's what they're paying for.
Yeah. And bear in mind that all the stuff that's already come out, you know, with the USAID specifically, it's only been 2 weeks. I mean, it seems a lot longer. It really does seem a lot longer since Donald Trump's been. It hasn't even been a month yet.
You haven't even gone to the Treasury yet.
Since he was inaugurated. So I'm sure that this is just going to be the tip of the iceberg.
And I think this is, I will give Trump and his administration full credit, because unlike last time round, they've actually gone in with a plan and a strategy early on to say, we're not going to mess around. We're going to do this from day one. And they were all set. They had all their ducks in a row, and the Democrats can't keep up with them.
No,
because there's so much stuff they're finding and they're putting out. So,
well, I think it's important to remember that one of the first things that Trump said after he was inaugurated is, somebody asked me, says, well, you know, how do you feel about really only having kind of right now, like 18 months to kind of get done what you want, you know, before things possibly ramp up to the midterms when things change? He says, I don't have 18 months. I have 100 days basically to get going with everything I want to do. So he knows that he's going to try to do as much as he can, as quickly as he can.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we look back at the BBC, the history of the BBC, the golden years of television, which produced not just classic Doctor Who, but dozens, if not hundreds, of quality TV shows that are exported all over the world, that gave the brand a prestige in itself, to the position now, a few decades on, where it's up for influence to whoever's willing to put their hands deep enough in their pockets in such a way. It really is quite a fall from grace. I mean, we're used to losing respect for individuals. Our politicians aren't statesmen and women anymore, are they? I think we all know that they're all greedy liars who are in it. You know, they've got no positive outlook. They've got no long-term vision. They're in it for what they can get in the here and now.
Negativity and
as soon as they possibly can. Yeah, of course. So we're used to that. But when we were not that long ago, it seemed to be the case that we could look to institutions such as the BBC, knowing that they were public funded, and be of the belief they were being ran in our best interests. Even if we didn't like whoever they'd recently cast as Doctor Who, you think, well, they're still, that's a matter of, it's subjective, it's a matter of personal taste. They are still being run in our best interest with our money. They wouldn't possibly lie to us deliberately, obfuscate the truth, conduct social experiments on us, for example, to change the way that we think and to re-engineer the British public on a social level. And yet that's exactly what they have been doing, looking on reflection since the Equality and Diversity Charter was published in 2015, 2016, which you think at the time, that made for rum reading, but you think, well, there's lots of charters at the BBC and they get looked at every few years, and some get renewed and adjusted, others get abandoned because they've served their purpose or are not right for the times anymore. But in the last 10 years, they've been repurposed and kind of weaponized against the public, against the people who are paying for the license fee, the customer base, the populace of Britain.
And I would also say, Dan, all of these programs that have been weaponized against the public, how many of them in that time period have been successes? I would say I can't think of any successes myself. I would say that all of them have fallen on their backsides, really, because, Gary can probably speak for the US more than I can, but certainly for me, speaking for being a Brit, we can take so much, but we will not have it constantly pushed in our faces.
John, I know that your dad worked for the BBC and he was very proud of it, and you were all very proud collectively of that, his friends and family. Can you think back through the decades? The BBC now is so rife with bias and so much blatant disinformation that they had to create their own arm, which they badged as something to deliberately combat misinformation and disinformation under the name BBC Verify. And yet within 24 hours of it operating, they were found to be rife. Everything they published was liars. But in the old days, a new department for such things just wasn't required. The fact that something was being published, produced, and broadcast under that BBC banner would have been enough to install trust. They would never have needed to. No, you can trust us. Honest, you can. You can. Look. We're called BBC Verify. You can. And so it's the more that somebody protests, the more they're trying to hide.
Absolutely. And I just again from my memories of the BBC, I've said to you before, guys, that my dad was like a bit of a local hero because he worked for the BBC. And my dad started as an engineer, going up transmitters and fixing them. And then he got promoted and he was at BBC Bristol. Then he went to be involved with running the news section at BBC Southampton. And, as a kid, Christmas parties, they always had in the studios at BBC Bristol, they had a Christmas party for the kids with bouncy castles where you play in the studios. Everybody was welcome, which was great. I remember him, Gary won't know what this is, but he snuck me and my brother in at BBC Bristol to watch the Really Wild show being recorded, which was great. And it just had a magical feel. And even when you're at school and kids were talking, you'd say your dad worked at the BBC, there was a love and a respect for the BBC from kids. Now, that's not the case at all. The BBC has fallen so low in people's minds. And even for me, and I'm sure you're the same, Dan, I grew up and just seeing that BBC Globe going round was, I'm home from school, I'm going to watch something great,
I'm not sure that a great many children now would be aware of the BBC at all, if not for their activity within schools programs. And they're still very much present in places of education and libraries. But if you were to ask them what the BBC actually did, you'd get a blank expression, because it is Netflix, YouTube, Amazon, a push.
Absolutely. And the other thing I would say to you, Dan, is growing up, I always remembered the BBC of basically sticking solidly to science and biology. And, you know, you probably remember you had Tomorrow's World on weekly. That was a science-based program.
Very responsible in the things they said.
Exactly. Now it's like night and day, isn't it? You know, science is kind of being chucked out the window. Biology is being chucked out the window. And it's just, oh, well, you know, there's certainly people that have got their claws into the BBC that are pushing this narrative.
But I think that what I'm saying is that the integrity and trust simply isn't there anymore. And I think that this insistence that they can be trusted, fake it until you make it. This is the BBC doing that. I think that the global coof 4 or 5 years ago, I still don't know what I'm allowed to say about that on YouTube, so I'll skip over the subject. I think that changed things drastically, the difference between what was information and what was misinformation. And the BBC were up to their necks in that. In fact, I'll clarify that the whole of the mainstream media was complicit in misleading the British public on that. You could see, even in what little I saw, you could see, and this is what they would publish on YouTube and things like that, the narratives being changed. It was a time where we were finding out new things all the time, and it was an entirely new experience for practically everybody that's alive now. Unprecedented times we were living through. You're still very aware that what one person was saying one day, they were saying something completely different by the end of the week. You think, well, this is a little suspicious.
For the thing that can't be named, I would also say the fact that one example would be where a lot of people were saying there's a lot of evidence that it's come from a lab in China that happens to be just down the road from a wet market. Right. And basically they were labeled as conspiracy theorists, and they were poo-pooed and they were shunned by the BBC and other media organizations. And what has happened, and this was under the Biden administration, and it's just come out recently that the CIA believe from their data it has come from a Chinese lab. So
of course.
They knew that. We knew that at the time because the evidence was pushing that way, you know, but yet they still pushed this narrative. And it was, I mean, it was actually like waking up in a parallel universe at the time, because I was thinking, the BBC are doing this. What's going on? I always remember, you know, growing up as a kid, even as a kid, when the 6 o'clock news came on, it was, oh, this is serious stuff. You know, you're going to listen to this. These people know what they're talking about, and I trust them. Now, I try to watch as little BBC news as I can, because it's just not factual. I will say, you know, I wouldn't say he's the most perfect person in the world. He's a human being after all. But Elon Musk buying X, or Twitter as it was at the time, is a godsend, because when you were talking earlier, Dan, about BBC Verify, that only came about because they used it to try and counter Community Notes on X, which he launched on there. So they were trying to counter it. But the difference was the Community Notes are well respected, whereas BBC Verify isn't. So
I'm very careful, Gary, because I am quite a fan of Elon Musk. I've found him, most of the things that he's done in the last 18 months, actually, to 2 years, impressive. But I'm very careful to mark him out as some sort of hero, because I think if you build people up to that extent, you know, you're kind of on a hide into nothing, really. And he's clearly a flawed individual. But in buying Twitter and deconstructing it, rebuilding it as X, I think that was a genuinely heroic thing to do. Yes. That will, when the history books are written, will be looked back on as a thing that was key a key moment when the culture changed, and where, for the most part, where the fortunes of certainly those on your side of the Atlantic, where things started to change for the better.
I absolutely agree. I want to say also that the way a few minutes ago that you described the British media's reaction to the crisis, you could have been describing my country, because it was the exact same over here. And as far as Musk goes, I think that his doing that came along at a time where there was a real genuine threat to our First Amendment. I mean, it's you know, people say it's a cliche. It's like, well, you know, the First Amendment's going to get destroyed. We were very close to having that happen, all in the name of, you know, quelling, you know, the panic, quelling the uncertainty.
For those who don't know, Gary, can you summarize the First Amendment for us in a couple of sentences?
First Amendment is that you have, basically, it's a guarantee of free speech. You can't endanger anybody with it, but in pretty much, but that anybody who will, and I wish I had the whole thing memorized. I did at one point when I was in school, but basically you have a massive burden of proof if you are going to try to squelch an American citizen's right to exercise their right to free speech. But
gotcha.
The crisis was so unprecedented that you saw everybody from political leaders to celebrities to commentators going, you know, F free speech, you know, the anti-vaxxers. This is a crisis. You know, people should be willing to toss away their rights. We've got to get this under control. And to make it sound very high-minded, when it was basically another move to just for control. But we were very close to, I think that was their move. They said, you know, once people's right to free expression and free speech was quelched in the name of getting us through this crisis, we were very close to that.
And Gary, what you were just saying there, and about our BBC media mirroring what the US media were doing. I mean, this just goes back to what we were saying at the beginning as well, when we were talking about the fact about this funding from USAID. It's quite a coincidence, and this is me I haven't got the evidence in front of me, but the fact is, all of the media lining up to push the exact same narrative. Now, for me, that is a red flag for me all day long, because you would think at least there would be some elements around the world, or what they call the free world.
Well, also,
it would push a different theory or a different view.
But also, John, for those of us, of the British people who are still BBC customers, who do still pay for a TV license every month or annually, again, something that's sort of got lost in the cracks of all this is that license fee is paid partly on the understanding, on the assurance that it will enable the BBC to remain UK focused and completely independent as a broadcasting standard. So detached from any outside influences at all. And, you know, you look at this thing, the BBC Media Action Charity, that bears all the hallmarks of a classic loophole to get round Ofcom regulations. Absolutely. And you know what? Ofcom have probably been turning a blind eye to it as well. So you've got that in one corner. And then you've got the fact that with the amount of money that's raised from the BBC TV license anyway, according to their remit from the UK government, you'd look at the figures, there's more than enough there for them to meet that remit and to make appropriate programming to a reasonable amount, hours per year. And if it has got beyond a sustainable amount, then it's up to the BBC to cut their cloth, to cut their channels, cut their broadcasting hours if they have to, certainly cut the salaries of a number of their biggest names, and to just bring it all in a bit in the way that any other private company would have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I just the trouble that's
the way to save the BBC, to do that, to cut the cloth and to defund them now, to meet that problem head on. And this is the same right across the board with the BBC. They won't, and it's reflective of our politicians that I was talking about earlier on. None of them are far-sighted. If they can see a problem that's coming up, they'll do everything they can to avoid it in the here and now, to get as much money in their bank accounts as they possibly can, so they can fuck off and retire before before it all actually hits.
I watched someone a couple of weeks ago, and he had an ex-politician on his channel. And this politician was effectively saying,
just YouTube and independent. And basically, this politician said, each government that comes in knows what the real problems are, knows they have to fix the economy, knows they have to fix the immigration, but they can't be bothered with doing it because they want to be voted in at the next election. So all they do is just keep kicking the can down the road. Short-termism.
Exactly. And, you know,
is that a word?
Dan, it is. And it fits us perfectly because you look at us, Dan, and, you know, that does bear fruit by what we've seen over the last 20 years that's coming to fruition in the UK. And we've got big problems because we haven't got anybody on either side of the aisle, bar potentially a new outfit coming in, which is reform, that could potentially
upset the
reverse a lot of this and upset the apple cart. And you know, I'll jump into another thing quickly as well. I mean, with all this BBC funding and everything coming from other sources, one thing that I don't often get angry, but I'm very passionate about, is the fact that, look, whatever sexuality you are, whatever race you are, whatever you believe, that's your business. Go away and do it in your own time. But when you go after kids, when you when you are directing it at children, that's when I've got a problem, and I will fight to the death if I have to protect kids. I mean, I've got a great niece in the family who's adorable, and I'm thinking about her growing up as well. And just the stuff, you know, especially with what has been announced recently about Doctor Who, it just beggars belief with me that, you know, after everything that the BBC has been found to have covered up or kept had a blind eye to over the decades, and you're telling me that nobody did a proper vetting job. They knew what they were doing when they allowed certain people to come in to write for Doctor Who, and they just ignored it. But yet, these people within that production team, they'll be quite happy to call Trump a monster every day of the week. I'm just a guy that likes to enjoy his sci-fi stuff, which has been destroyed over the last few years. But if you think I'm a person that's quite relaxed most of the time, if you replicate that across the UK and probably worldwide as well, how many more people like me are thinking exactly the same? And they're like, we're not going anywhere near that. We're not letting our kids go anywhere near that program. You know, that's where we are at the moment.
Because Doctor Who is just the one show, isn't it, Gary? And we're all obsessed with it. And I think it's probably internationally, it's likely to be one of the brands, if not the brand, that is now associated with the BBC. That if an international viewer is aware of it, then they almost certainly think of Doctor Who in the same breath. So to see Doctor Who sort of wrapped up in all of this, and the BBC wrapped up in all of this, it's distasteful, isn't it? It does large, long-term, far-reaching damage at a time where they're trying to be international in scale rather than domestic. That's the irony.
Well, one of the things that I think will always be true is, even in America, we loved Doctor Who for its Britishness, and any attempt to make it, to strip it of that, which for, America added to its charm, its quirkiness, its essential identity. Even when it was brought over, with New Who, when it hit over here big with Matt Smith and all of that, it was still the Britishness of it all, which made it so well loved over here.
Despite the co-investors and the increased budget,
it doesn't
enough.
Yeah, it doesn't matter to us like who's airing it. It doesn't matter like what we have to do to watch it. Do we go on iPlayer? Do we tune on Disney Plus? Whatever. It's not about who broadcasts it. It's about what it is. It's essential nature. It's essential, British nature. I don't think that, people have said, well, I don't like Disney, so I'm not going to watch Doctor Who. I mean, I'm sure there's a minority of people who say that, but it's never about, we don't associate the worth of the show or the worth of the current version of it with where it's being broadcast. No. It has to do with how much is the essential nature of the show still, what it's always been. And the fact that it's turned so far from that is what's, I think, what people are reacting to, not necessarily the fact that it's on Disney. Although this week, Disney is in the midst now of apparently tossing overboard its whole DEI allegiance. So it'll be interesting to see how much that affects, in the next few months.
Decide to clean decks completely, to clean house completely.
I'm cynical on that, guys. And I mean, the reason I say that is because Iger's met Trump, so he's bent the knee to Trump, and he's trying to do things to appease Trump. So they're going to say we're getting rid of DEI, but they'll quietly rebadge it in other ways. I can see them doing that because you've still got money from
people on the left seem to operate.
Yeah, so I would love
call it something else. Nobody will notice.
Yeah, and again, I always make the example of Disney like a big cruise ship, ironically, and it takes a long time to turn. And if you're truly going to do that, they've filled that company with so many ideologically captured activists. You're going to have a massive purge of Disney before you can get all of that out. So that's going to take you a few years at least before you even start producing stuff that potentially people would consider normal content.
As regards Doctor Who, we're so far away from anything being righted in any way. I mean, since the last run of Type 40 Live ended a few weeks ago, within a few days we got clarification of who the writers are going to be, like you were saying there, John, which was, whilst not a massive surprise, still quite stark reading. And within a couple of days, everything was dragged out about one of those people in particular, which has, it's proven too much for me. It's the straw that breaks the camel's back for me. And I suspect that by the time those episodes reach the screen, when that story, it's going to grow. The momentum behind that is going to grow. And I predict the fallout from it is not going to be pretty when the general public, when the license fee payer manages to track it all back, put all the various pieces together. So we are now going into completely new waters. I don't think it's gonna end well. The BBC, obviously, they're still officially regulated by Ofcom. This money that's come from the Biden government, through BBC media action? It's another question. But the fact that there is a now exposed loophole, the BBC, and this is the first time I've ever known this to be true. So within about 2 days of this making the press, the BBC did put out this statement on the whole affair. And under the heading here, Media Action, our statement on USAID funding. And they say a free press is essential to freedom and democracy. I mean, who's going to argue with that? This is the typical guy. And 75% of countries around the world do not have a free press. That's so true. BBC Media Action supports local media around the world to deliver trusted information to people most in need. All of this sounds so reasonable. This sounds like they're talking about the BBC of old, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And like many international development organizations, it says BBC Media Action has been affected by the temporary pause in US government funding, which amounts to about 8% of our income. And if you notice, they only mentioned 2023 to 2024. So how much it was before. We're doing everything we can to minimize the impact on our partners and the people we serve, which is, again, we're putting our customers first, our audience first. This is all very, very diplomatic, isn't it, John? And it finishes by saying, as the BBC's international charity. So as long as you use the word charity, people always back off at that word, don't they?
Yeah.
Because we are completely separate from BBC News and wholly reliant on our donors and supporters to carry out our work. So if you look too closely, if you make insinuations, if you dig, you could affect the amount of money that goes into a charitable endeavor that serves people who are in need. So this is the standard party line. It's saying something without actually saying anything.
It is. And the other thing I would say on this as well, guys, is the fact that they're saying that, this USAID through BBC Media Action, it amounts to about 8% of their income, 2023-24. When Trump's campaign and the Doge have finished their complete investigation into all departments, I wonder how much higher that 8% is going to be while it's finangled through different charities and sources, because this isn't going to be the end of it. I can guarantee you that. And it's a massive scandal. I think
they're doing everything they can to minimize it, aren't they? It's significance, the language that's being used they're trying to make sure that the conversation gets shut down as quickly as possible.
Exactly right. And the trouble we've got in this country now is that you've got the current government who are going to turn a blind eye to it, and then you've got the opposition who are, quite frankly, they never seem to ask the right questions, and they were more than likely aware of it when they were in power.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And
I blame them just as much.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what I am respectful of the Trump administration for is the fact that they are going after all of this from the source. So my view is what they're trying to do is they're trying to cut the snake's head off so the body will die. Yeah. Because if you cut the funding right from the beginning, all of these DEI cobblers and these propaganda pieces, they will all wither and die. And because this is
effectively claiming ignorance, John, of anything other than charitable endeavours, isn't it? To say, we couldn't possibly have interfered in any conceivable way. But it goes through BBC Media Action through this charity, which isn't Ofcom regulated, which means that they can do pretty much whatever they want. They're able to accept funds from wherever and whoever under any criteria at all, on the pretense that because it's for charity, it's okay, and Ofcom can't interfere whatsoever.
It is crazy. I mean, myself personally, I think Ofcom are just as much captured now. I think that they let so much stuff slide because they've got the same activists in Ofcom now. But again, this is them being found out to be having a what I call a slush fund to do their propaganda
Mhm.
pieces, and to go, look, you know, it's not part of BBC News, it's not part of the BBC, it's a charity, it's separate, you know, and it goes all the way back into Doctor Who. It goes all the way back into all the other programs that are being put out by the BBC. You know, there's no doubt in my mind that there's some donations from that charity going into the BBC in some form or other through a different.
It's symptomatic of the entire problem, and the aroma that's coming off Doctor Who is a prime example. It's not the only one by a long chalk, but it's a significant one because the brand is so large, so recognizable, and it's their biggest export. So it's understandable that people point directly at this show, at our show. So just to be clear, what we can definitely say, because the BBC have owned up to this, they've come clean, that 2.16 million of their funding last year, from the year 2023 to 2024 financial year, came from USAID. And it's through their BBC Media Action charity, which means it's unregulated and outside of any legislation by Ofcom.
Yeah. And you know, I think it's important to remember that in that statement that you had up, the very first line of it, you know, was basically restating kind of a component of the First Amendment, which is that the government can't make any laws which cut off, you know, freedom of the press or freedom of speech. But essentially, because of the crisis that we were talking about earlier, the media was basically handing over that to the government anyway. They were basically saying, sure, we'll do whatever you want us to do. They didn't need to make a law. Britain's government didn't need to pass a law controlling what the media would say, because why bother to do that when the media is already complicit? The only thing they have to worry about is the voices of the actual people. So that statement about USAID, and even the very name USAID, that sounds, it's aiding people. You know, it's a good thing.
And who would argue against a charitable work being given funds, freeing up funds for them to continue doing that charitable work? It's always the same moves from these people. The 2.16 million was enhanced, should we say, was boosted with another large sum from another Biden regime agency. That's the National Democratic Institute. So the total of money from the American taxpayer that came to the BBC through the BBC Media Action charity, let's be clear at every junction that we can about this, it's all total $3.5 million.
And it'll go up and up and up as we go along.
I'm just trying to figure out how much of my own personal paycheck was going to Bad Wolf.
Yeah. And, you know, we always joke Doctor Who is funded by the British public, you know, but we can't use that anymore, can we? Because
doesn't look like it.
US have been funding it as well.
Yeah, we're co-producers now.
Yeah. So
officially,
this just is a red flag in so many ways. If we were talking about this as Russia or China, that media and these news corporations, they would be all across it saying, you know, they're undemocratic, you know, there's no freedom of speech, it's propaganda. This is no different whatsoever. This is exactly the same. And as Gary was saying earlier, you know, it's USAID is meant to sound nice to get you all happy about it. Oh yeah, they're doing good works, but you know, all they're doing is they're pushing things on people who don't want that pushed on them, and that's very frightening, you know. And they're suppressing other news and other information as well. Yeah. And I was never a conspiracy theorist, never have been, but the last few years have really opened my eyes about a lot of stuff.
What's the, I mean, at the core of it for me personally is that it's heartbreaking that something which is at its best, maybe with classic Who, all things to all people, it can be enjoyed by whoever because its outreach was universal. Its appeal was universal. Because it was never about dividing people or being, ist or whatever, or speaking only to one type of audience member. And now what's heartbreaking is that it's become this tool in, subverting culture, divide, so divisive or whatever, when before it's just gone, from A to Z in terms of, at its best, it was, just everything. And now it's become just a political tool. And that's what to me is the most heartbreaking.
Gary, you're right. And I would also say of how bad it's got, you could actually write a Doctor Who story about all of this with the Doctor involved, because the Doctor would fight against this tooth and nail. He would be against all of this, and he would look to pull it all down if it was the Doctor. And you could write a story about this and how this is all going on. And you've got you have the activists on there are going, the Doctor is love and all that's nonsense. At the end of the day, the Doctor is not love. The Doctor is about, doing what's right. And he would see this and he would basically say, right, no, that's it. That has to go. And he would look to stop that. That's where we are now, sadly, where I actually see it and think I'm watching something now that the Doctor would actually fight against, because he would see it as propaganda.
I think the one story that just popped into my mind that basically is the encapsulation of everything we're talking about is the Sunmakers.
Yeah.
Where the Doctor, fights against the company, which is basically, lulled its people, into this kind of suppression. And all hail the company, tax them to death, all whatever. And the Doctor comes in and basically ends up kind of flushing it all, literally and figuratively,
and I think we're in the worst possible time as well, because although you've got this money coming in, you've got producers of the current iteration of Doctor Who it's not like you've got to shake their conscience to start writing all of this stuff, because they were licking their teeth just wanting to talk about this stuff anyway. So you're basically giving them a green light and a slush fund of money to basically go ahead and do what you want to do and do your propaganda. And again, what's so great about it, though, is the only silver lining for me is the fact that it's tanking spectacularly. And over the last few years, every time they've tried this in this show or other shows, it's a failure. And I really hope we're getting to the final end game of it, and it's all starting to come out. But Dan, I mean, you probably think a bit like me, but we're still a bit down the river from the United States with our current government in this country, where I don't
painfully
think
so
it's stopping for a while. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think we're just going to have to bide our time. Yeah. And I hope we come out the other side of it.
We'll loan our president to you once he finishes with us. We'll let him come over there for a little while and help you all out.
We'd be happy to share your current president and to share our Doctor Who with you, of course, Gary, you and all your countrymen. I just wish it could be in slightly better shape than it is presently. I'd like to say, keep Doctor Who British. I don't think even Gary, you wouldn't argue with that for a moment. Would you keep Doctor Who British?
Absolutely, not at all.
We wanted to get together and have a chat about this because it's been on our minds for much of the last week or so. Maybe it has been on yours too. So let us know in the comments what your thoughts are, and if you're particularly politically astute and informed better than me. It wouldn't be very hard, would it? If you are, let us
better
know
than
your
me.
thoughts in the comment section as well. You know, whether you're British or American when you read this, now you've processed it. What are your thoughts? Do you feel kind of misled? If you're American, do you feel cheated? Do you feel robbed? Let us know. Where's your head at with this? And if I were you, like American Doctor Who fans, since you have sort of got a stake in it now, I'd get writing, get complaining like the rest of us.
I know if I'm gonna be funding Doctor Who, I want Doctor Who to be as good as it can be.
We should have like the old show, shouldn't we, Dan, of like in the 80s where you had like John Nathan Turner coming on. He had to explain to the audience why the episode was so bad and he'd look to do better. We need that now. We need that back. Why have you taken our money, RTD?
You know what? I just realized that we need to have, over here, we used to have, and individual public broadcasting stations used to do the pledge drives. Where back in the old days, you'd have like banks of people sitting in a couple of rows on the phones, taking calls.
Yeah.
If you watch Masterpiece Theater, or if you watch Mystery, or if you watch Doctor Who, whatever, you call in, pledge. Oh, I want, I'll give you give us $75. We'll give you a mug. And your money will go to whatever. Maybe like we need to do this again after.
But Gary, the people who made these programs did used to feel like they were accountable for the things that they broadcast. And sometimes it would happen quickly. Sometimes it would happen weeks or even months later. And you'd get some sort of video on one feedback show or another, and it would fade up from black, and a producer or a director, and now and again a star, but it was mostly a producer or director, would sort of be seen to be sitting down on a console in some upper room in a gallery somewhere with banks of screens behind them, and they just sort of sit sympathetically on the edge of a desk and say, lean into the camera and say, "Look, I know that you've just watched a load of old shit, but
but it's my shit."
Roll out the case for the defense and promise never to pinch off another link of it in your direction ever again. And invariably, of course, they did. Probably
we need some kind of national. We need like a national Doctor Who pledge drive where it's kind of like Children in Need or whatever, where it goes national, where the U.S. raises money that's just going to go to better Doctor Who.
Yeah. So for USDW instead of USAID or something like that, slush fund for us to basically campaign to get them out. Thanks
for coming in on this one, guys. I wasn't quite sure where the conversation was going to go, but I think we had to have it. You kind of drew the short straws.
It's great. I just talk my usual BS, so it's fine.
Thank you.
My social studies teacher would give me an F for not remembering the wording of the First Amendment exactly.
She'll be in the chat in a week's time.
You've been watching Type 40 Extra. This is our before show, after show, and in between show to the podcasts, the live streams, and other video content that we put out here at Type 40 across YouTube, Rumble, and X, and the podcatchers. So let us know your thoughts on this conversation and everything else that's been going on the channel too. And thanks again, Gary Akers and John Yulden here. And we'll see you in the comments. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.